So we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. It's a little bit after 11. I'm Tracy Whitlock. I work in the Maine Department of Education. I work in the Office of Special Services, and I work with special projects, special initiatives, and dyslexia is one of those that I work with. My background is I was a classroom teacher, I was a literacy professor, and before coming to Maine, I worked at the Ohio Department of Education, working with beginning teachers and mentoring and teacher leadership support. So enough about me. You are here to learn about dyslexia, and we're going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. So before we get started, I've muted all the microphones because otherwise we'll hear, I know a lot of you are probably holding class in your own home. I apologize later on if you hear some drums. We have band practice going on at my house today, and we also have some English class going on. So if you hear things, I apologize. My son asked me if he should not play, and I was like, no, absolutely, you need to play. So I knew you would all understand because I'm sure a lot of you are going through the same experience. Please post any questions that you have in the chat box. Because there are so many people that are going to be on this call today, it's going to be difficult for me to manage the presentation and the chat box. But what I'll do afterwards is I will go on and pull all of those questions and put together some FAQs for you so that you can get your questions answered at a different time. And then I'll send those out to everyone who participates. Additionally, to receive the credit, the 1 hour credit for being in the webinar with us today, if you would send me an email, because I know you have my email address, and that's going to be at the end of the presentation as well. Just send me your favorite, the title of your favorite children's book. I love children's literature. One of my big loves when I was working as a literacy professor. So I've posted a couple on this slide that are my favorites. So that'll just show me that you were at the webinar, because otherwise people won't be sending me random children's books titles. So that's how I'll be able to send you a certificate. So take a couple minutes and just sit back and think about, what was literacy instruction like for you as a kid? Do you remember learning to read? Do you remember thinking about what reading was, what the process was for you, how you felt about reading? So was it a positive experience? Was it a negative experience? Think about when you were 8, 9, 10 years old, or maybe your own children or grandchildren that you're helping to read. So think about that for a second and how you felt or they may feel. And you'll find that people have very different experiences when it comes to reading. One is they may have the love to read mode. It's, I love to read. It helps me to escape, which a lot of us probably feel like we want to do right now, and laugh and feel and question. And it's something that's just, you feel connected to and you want to do it. You want to be reading. Your kids are excited. My own family, I can remember just my kids being just excited. We'd go to the store, go to the library and get new books. And it was an exciting event because it was something that they enjoyed doing. But then there might be some of you who feel like this little guy, just frustrated. Your own experiences of, I really want to read. I'm trying my hardest to read, but I just don't get it. And I don't understand why everyone else gets it. And for some kids, learning to read looks like it's just magical. And that's just, why can they just pick it up and I can't? And so it can be so terribly frustrating for kids. And I know that's why you're here, so that we can grow together and learn more about those struggling readers and what we can do to help and support them. So here's our agenda for today. We are going to start with debunking some myths. I'm sure you've heard a lot of myths about dyslexia, so we'll be talking about those. We'll quickly touch on the national and state landscape in terms of dyslexia. You can be surprised frequently that there's so much going on across the country when it comes to dyslexia. What is the definition of dyslexia? How do you recognize those characteristics of dyslexic students? some literacy practices, and then some resources for you as educators, and then resources that you can share with families that you work with. So let's start with debunking some dyslexia myths. And I'm sure just sitting there for a minute, think about what is it that you think about dyslexia that you may be finding out that isn't accurate. So let's get started. So myth number one, only a few people have dyslexia. Fact, dyslexia is actually a common learning issue. Some experts believe between 5 and 10% of people have dyslexia. Others say as many as 17% of people show issues with reading and struggling with reading. And the truth is millions of people have dyslexia to all different degrees. My mouse got ahead of me. Myth number two, kids with dyslexia see backwards. This is a huge one that you'll see all over the place, that people will say they turn something around and they're like, oh, it's because I'm dyslexic. So dyslexia is it's one of the most common misconceptions, and it's a problem with how kids, it's not about how they see the words, it's a problem with language, and we're going to go into that in more depth. Some kids with dyslexia might write letters backwards, but some don't. And kids all the way up until like about a second grade may write their letters backwards, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they have dyslexia. So again, reversing letters is not necessarily a sign of dyslexia. Myth number three, dyslexia is a problem of vision, and it's not a problem with vision. Vision problems do not cause dyslexia, and kids with dyslexia are no more likely to have problems with their eyes or vision than any other kids. It's true that some kids with dyslexia might have problems with visual processing, but that's a different issue. That means the brain has problems with details and images and processing what the eyes are seeing. Those challenges can also make reading difficult. Kids with dyslexia aren't smart, which is an untrue and harmful myth. And I think sometimes kids feel that way, that we talked about how you may have felt as a reader when you were learning to read, if you struggled with reading, that, well, those kids are smart and I can't read yet, so I must not be smart. That is not true. And that is one of the things about dyslexia, is that students, there's a mismatch between what they're capable of and what they're able to do when it comes to terms of reading. So again, kids with dyslexia are definitely can be smart, and it is not an issue that has to do with that. So myth number five, kids just need to try harder to read. So when you see a student who's really experiencing frustration and just wants to push the book aside, it's easy to say, they just need to try harder. When in reality, they're really trying very, very hard. That they're trying to figure out what is it that's on that page. Whereas we look at it and can understand what the words are, they're really having to concentrate and focus to be able to do that. Myth number six, dyslexia doesn't show up until grade school. Dyslexia can show up in preschool and even earlier. And we're going to talk about some of those characteristics of dyslexia. So you'll see where you might start seeing those characteristics for younger kids. That's because dyslexia can affect language skills that are essential for reading. So it's that language piece again, not the vision, it's the language piece. Some signs that a preschooler may be at risk for dyslexia include difficulty rhyming. So if you're doing a fun nursery rhyme and they can't pick up on the rhyme scheme of it, that might be a clue that there might be an issue. And they might be a late talker, again, being a language issue. Myth number seven, dyslexia goes away when kids learn to read. Dyslexia is a lifelong issue. Intervention can make a huge difference for kids and helping them learn to read. But being able to read doesn't mean they're cured. And so I think that's important. I think helping kids to overcome dyslexia, helping kids to learn how to read, doesn't make the dyslexia go away. And that's a myth. I think that you may hear people say, oh, well, we can cure dyslexia. It doesn't go away. It's how the brain functions and how the brain processes language and the reading process. Dyslexia can affect more than one just basic reading skill. It can make it difficult to read quickly and accurately. It can impact how well kids comprehend what they're reading. And kids with dyslexia may also continue to struggle with spelling and writing, even once they learn to read. Another harmful myth, dyslexia is caused because parents don't read to kids at home. This is not the case. This is not about exposure, and that if someone just read to a student more or participated more in reading with them, that all of a sudden they would magically be able to read. It doesn't happen, again, because of lack of exposure. It's not caused, it's happened because of lack of exposure. It's a neurological condition, and people who don't know your kid's family may wrongly make that kind of accusation, which can be really harmful and really frustrating for the child and the parents. And that's another thing to remember too, is how frustrating this can be for parents. They want the best for their children. They really want to do everything they can to help their child learn how to read. And they may have other kids in their family that they're able to pick up reading, and they're able to do some basic reading and going over sounds and letters with their kids, and they pick up on it. But their dyslexic student doesn't. And that's because they're going to need that more extensive support and intervention. Another myth is that kids who don't speak English can't have dyslexia. Well, dyslexia doesn't have anything to do with the English language. Dyslexia has to do with the brain functions and how the brain, it's a neurological condition. So it's not about the English language. So you can be dyslexic and speak any type of language, any other language. And again, this goes back to one that was earlier. Kids with dyslexia are lazy. They're really trying so hard. They're working at it. Just think about if you were trying to learn something that you knew everyone else knew how to do, and it was really difficult for you to do it, and how frustrating that can be and how that might look. So sometimes you might pick up on some of these things that you think a child may have dyslexia based on how even behavior of, I don't want to read, I don't want to do this, and where you may think that lots of behavior the child is just acting out. Well, thinking about why are they acting out? They may be acting out because they're unable to read and that frustration. And so they may learn, and sometimes kids figure out strategies of how to get away from the reading or cover it up so that others don't know because they're embarrassed to share that. So let's define dyslexia. And this is the definition the state uses, and quite a few other states use the same definition. So again, it's a specific learning disability that's neurological in origin. And so if you look at an IEP, you're not going to see in the state of Maine dyslexia listed on an IEP because it's considered a specific learning disability. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. So difficulty in coding and being able to think about a word and spell it, and then decoding, thinking about the word, seeing the word and being able to decode it and figuring out what word it is. Now, that doesn't mean that students with dyslexia struggle with comprehension. If they hear someone read a story, they can have wonderful, exceptional comprehension skills from that listening piece. It's the being able to process and take the reading themselves and understand it. And when you're reading frequently at such a slow rate, it's really difficult to comprehend the material you're reading. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component, and that's what we were talking about earlier, that sound element that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. So again, it's that mismatch between what a kid is capable of doing and what they are doing. A secondary consequence may include problems in reading comprehension. We've touched upon that a little. And reduced reading experience that can impede the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So thinking about, and we'll talk more about this, about the different components of literacy, but that if you're a student isn't able to read at a quicker pace and be able to process their reading, they're not able to be exposed to as much vocabulary. So thinking about if you are reading on grade level and the types of words that you're being exposed to and vocabulary may be different for a student who's a struggling reader. So let's take a quick look at the national landscape. This is from the National Center on Improving Literacy. What they do is they look at states to see what type of legislation is out there related to dyslexia. And so you can see, it's not really coming through on this screen, I don't think, but the states in blue have some type of literacy, have some type of dyslexia legislation, so including Maine. So very few states do not have some type of legislation around dyslexia. It depends on the state, what it looks like. Some may have screening, others may have types of intervention, things that they do for students. In Maine, we have the Maine Revised Statute, which requires SAUs to screen students in kindergarten through second grade who have difficulty in phonological and phonemic awareness, sound symbol recognition, alphabet knowledge, decoding skills, rapid naming skills, and encoding skills. So phonological and phonemic awareness can be thought of as an umbrella, and phonemic awareness is part underneath that umbrella. So phonological awareness is dealing with rhyming schemes, being able to, a student being able to do rhymes and nursery rhymes, being able to clap out syllables, because it's all about that auditory piece and what they can process what they're hearing. Phonemic awareness is being able to look at the sounds in a word. For example, the word cat. Phonemic awareness is if you tell a child, can you tell me what parts you hear in the word cat? Typically, normally, a student who's developed and isn't having issues with dyslexia will be able to say at, whereas that might be more difficult for a student who's facing dyslexia. Sound symbol recognition, again, that sound and making the connection between the C is going to make these sounds. Alphabet knowledge, understanding their names. Decoding skills we've talked about is looking at the word and being able to break it apart. Rapid naming skills, this is another one that, especially when kids are younger, you can pick up on if there's an issue. So kids knowing their colors, recognizing their numbers, recognizing other colors, names, pictures of different items, and being able to do it quickly. And then encoding, so being able to think about what that word is and then being able to spell it. So again, in the state of Maine, we are required, SAUs are required to have some type of screening in kindergarten through second grade to identify if a student has characteristics of dyslexia. So again, recognizing those characteristics and thinking about what it is that students need in those areas. So let's take a couple minutes to look at what that may look like in each grade, some grade bands, because obviously in preschool and high school, it's going to look obviously a little bit differently. So preschool, and we talked about this already, so that phonological awareness, that umbrella, nursery rhymes, Jack and Jill, and things like that, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. They're not able to remember the rhymes, they're not able to pick up on those. Difficulty learning and remembering the names of the letters in the alphabet, unable to recognize letters in their own name. Persistent baby talk. So as children develop, and they're becoming, 3 and 4 years old, they're still participating in more baby talk. Again, rhyming patterns, and then family history. So if a student has parents who are dyslexic or a sibling who's dyslexic, then that is something that you would want to consider, because it would be something that could be a red flag that there might be an issue for the student. Kindergarten and first grade, reading errors that show no connection to the sounds on the page. So for example, if the word is dog on the page, the child says puppy. Well, that's close, right? And they may have used some context clues, which is not a bad thing, but if they consistently do that instead of understanding that DOG is dog, and they're not making that connection to the letter sounds, then there could be an issue. Not understanding that words come apart. So again, looking back at the word, thinking about cat, bat, rat, thinking about how those words come apart, and it's k-at, and helping the kids to see that if they struggle with that, it can be an issue. Complains how hard reading is, that it's not something they're excited about doing, but it's just really hard work. Cannot sound out simple words, we just talked about. And just doesn't associate letters with sounds. So when they're looking at the letters, they're not making that connection that there's a sound that's associated with that. So elementary, upper elementary, middle, and high school. This is when we go from really looking at learning to read. So your younger readers all the way up to your older reader, second grade, third grade, they're really about learning to read. Once you get to upper and elementary, middle, and high school, then we're looking at reading to learn. And this is where it could really be a struggle for a child if there wasn't any intervention earlier in their school experiences. So again, they're going to be struggling with reading. They're going to be struggling with comprehension, because at this point they're being required not to read so that they can develop their reading skills. It's because they're reading to understand content areas. Writing, struggling with spelling, also struggling with handwriting. So messier handwriting, unable to, struggling in that area. Speaking, pausing for a word, trying to figure out exactly what the word is that they want to say, can be something that you might see in students. Particularly issues in content areas, for example, foreign language. Learning a foreign language can be very difficult for someone who has dyslexia, because if you're having issues learning and reading the language that you are natively speaking, it's very difficult to learn a foreign language. And then that social piece in high school and middle and elementary school of the feeling like I don't fit in, I don't understand, and I'm really struggling. If you ever have had the opportunity to talk with someone who's a young adult who's dyslexic, and how just the frustration if they have never gotten assistance and they get into high school and they're just still struggling, just the despair and the not wanting to even be at school. So think about going to something every day that you don't understand what's going on, and it's not getting better, and you're not getting the help you need. So it's why it's so important that we provide assistance for kids who are middle school and high school, and even more important that we figure out what it is that kids need at a younger age and provide that intervention for them then. So universal screeners. So the Maine state statute states that in Maine, SAUs are required to use a universal screener to find out if kindergarten through second graders have just characteristics of dyslexia. In no means is this a diagnostic tool in saying that the child has dyslexia. It's about having the characteristics, excuse me, of dyslexia. So if you could, in the chat box, so when I'm looking through the FAQs later, if you could type in what literacy screeners your school or your district uses, that would be really helpful information for me. We are working, I've only been in the department for a year, and one of the things that I'm working on right now is putting together some dyslexia stakeholder groups and trying to figure out what types of supports that we at the state can put in place to support districts as they're working through what are the screeners that they're using, what are the interventions that they're using across the state, so that possibly we could say, if you're trying to find out what a possible screener or an intervention that your district may be looking at, maybe we could connect you with another district who may have a similar population. So if you could let me know in the chat box what universal literacy screeners you may be using in your school from kindergarten through 2nd grade, that would be great. And then think about when you look at that screener in the future, think about, does it address the things that we've talked about? Does it address phonological and phonemic awareness, sound symbol correspondence, alphabet knowledge, decoding, rapid automatic naming and encoding? And then have the conversation with the teachers that you work with and your administration of, well, we do a screener. It's kindergarten through 2nd grade. We screen kids, but what do we do with it then? What is the next step? The legislation stops at that point. It doesn't tell the districts what to do once they've done the screening. It just requires that they go through the screening. So having that conversation with your teachers and with your administrators to just have that conversation of what do we do next? What do we do next to support the readers in our schools? So before we get into really talking about the interventions that are possible for kids who are dyslexic, I wanted to take a couple minutes to talk about literacy instruction in general. And I did recommend, if you signed up for this webinar, to also sign up for the literacy webinars that Dee Saucier is doing through the department, because she'll be going into much more detail when it comes to each of the areas being addressed in reading. And so I'm going to touch upon these, and then I'm going to talk more about the specific structured literacy that's recommended for kids who are dyslexic, but you can learn a lot through both of those lenses. So the National Reading Panel came out and said that there are 5 pillars of literacy instruction that we should focus on when we're working with kids in schools. And you're not going to be surprised by these. These are the ones that we've been talking about the whole time we've been on today. Phonological and phonemic awareness. When they did their research and looked at research studies across the decades and across the country and internationally, phonological and phonemic awareness are key to kids learning how to read. Now, again, we've talked about this. It looks different for different kids. Some kids, you may see that phonological and phonemic awareness, that development. Other kids, you may not. And so that's why this is so important as a screener when kids are younger. Obviously, phonics. I don't know if any of you know I remember being probably in middle school, and I was like, hooked on phonics, worked for me. And there was a whole huge phonics reading wars in the 1980s and 1990s, and seems to be picking up again of, do we have phonics in school or do we not? And really, when it comes to providing the best supports for kids who have dyslexia, phonics instruction, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail, is vital. Kids who are dyslexic cannot learn to read in the same rate and same pace as other kids if they're not provided with phonics instruction. Fluency. So it takes time to become a fluent reader. You have to be able to decode words quickly. You have to be able to see the word, know what the word is, and keep going and reading. And when you're having to stop and break apart every word, it slows down your fluency, and so which will lead to issues with vocabulary and comprehension, which are the other components of the national panel. So what we're going to talk a little bit about is explicit and sequential phonics instruction, because that's what the International Dyslexia Association has termed structured literacy, and that has been demonstrated that it provides support for kids. You may be familiar with different approaches when it comes to working with dyslexic readers. So there's the Orton-Gillingham approach, and then you'll see that approach, that multisensory approach to literacy, is going to address this explicit and sequential phonics instruction. And then your school may have a program that it uses. The state doesn't recommend any particular program, but if you do have a program that you know that you're using in your district, if you would put that in the chat box as well, again, that's just interesting and helpful information for us at the state as we work to put together supports for districts. So structured literacy is a trademark from the International Dyslexia Association, and it starts with some principles and methods. So the first is that it's systematic and cumulative. And so systematic meaning that there's a purpose and there's a sequence to what kids are doing. So it's the organization of the material follows a process. It's not just, well, today I think we'll do the family and tomorrow we'll do something else. It has to have that piece where it's sequential and it's cumulative. So it's not just we taught this sound or this word family yesterday, we're not going to talk about it anymore, we learned it. It's you have to keep going back and building on that, which takes a lot of time. It's explicit. It requires deliberate teaching. Again, it's not something that kids are just going to pick up on. It's that doesn't necessarily have to be one-on-one. Can be even you can do explicit instruction whole group, but it's being explicit about the phonics skills that you're teaching kids. And then diagnostic. So it's in a lot of what we do in classrooms is diagnostic. So you're doing observations and you're noticing what the kids are picking up on, or you're doing some a more formal type of assessment to see where they are and what their progress is. So it's being able to think about, this is where the student is, this is what we've worked on, but maybe you do an assessment and you notice that, well, we worked on this skill, but in this assessment, I noticed that they're still struggling with it. So it's that cumulative piece and that spiral. It's going back to what they were working on before so that you can provide that support for them. But again, it has to be systematic, sequential, there's a plan, and it's cumulative, and you're continuing to build off of it. Again, if you just have instruction where it's, today we feel like doing this letter and there's no purpose to it and no structure, then it can be really difficult for kids. They have to build upon it. So thinking about, let's go back to our cat, bat, rat. First, you have to understand the k and the at and the cat before you can start saying, well, let's look at some digraphs or some diphthongs where we're looking at, now it's chat instead of cat, and building on that. So you wouldn't want to introduce something that was more complex without building up those structures and those building pieces before that. And this is a diagram that the International Dyslexia Association also has about the structure of what the content is for structured literacy. So you're going to recognize some of these are words that we've already talked about, like the sound symbol, the syllables, but it's again looking at the phonology of the word. How's the word broken apart? What are the smallest units of sound in the word, those phonemes? So again, going back to k, at. But then thinking about also morphology and the morphemes, which are the chunks of words, and thinking about prefixes and suffixes, and then semantics and syntax. So it's much more complex than thinking about just those beginning sounds of words. And if you've ever had the opportunity to observe or spend some time with someone who's doing this intensive intervention with students, you'll see that they really are working on all of these pieces and building it up to provide that support for students. So I don't want us to stop and only talk about the things that kids struggle with and that it's negative. There are quite a few actually very famous people who have dyslexia and who do quite well because there are strengths for people, obviously, of all people, but strengths that dyslexic people have. So memory for stories. So thinking about when we talked about comprehension, then if you read a story to the student, they are able to recall the story. So it's not, again, a cognitive issue. It's about that processing and that language processing so that they are able to break apart the words and understand what the word to decode it. Puzzle solving skills and spatially reasoning, really being able to think about things and being able to break things apart. So I am not a person who can see those spatial issues. Um, Years ago, I know in the old SAT, I'm probably going to date myself a lot here, there were even pieces of like problems and puzzles that you had to spatially in your head think about how does that fit in a different place. And I always struggle with those, but kids who have dyslexia can really see those things in a that three-dimensional way, and sometimes it helps with them with like breaking things apart and building things and putting them together. So they're able to have that skill. They're empathizers. Think about if you're struggling and you see someone else who's struggling, you can have some empathy for that person and be supportive to other people. Imaginative and thinking about different and creative ideas, abstract thinkers, thinking out of the box, and just able to really astutely analyze things and think about them in a different way. And so this comes from Dyslexia Help at the University of Michigan. So if you want to do some more exploration of strengths, there is the International Dyslexia Association also has some resources for helping kids to just be proud of who they are. And we talk about being able to say for kids that this doesn't makes me different, but it doesn't make me a bad student, or it's all about being a positive for kids who are struggling with this. So on our department webpage, we have done a complete overhaul of the dyslexia webpage. So I recommend when you have a chance, which I'm sure you're all very, very busy right now, to take a look at what we have out there. So we have some federal guidance from the Office of Special Education Programs, 5 questions parents and educators can ask about dyslexia, but we have all 3 different sections about resources for educators and resources for families that you could take a look at. One that I'd like to show you, and there's some modules and some webinars, is Reading 101 is from Reading Rockets. And so I highly recommend if you have the opportunity. It provides, it's not dyslexia focused, but it is literacy focused in a way that could be supportive of dyslexic students. So it's not going to give you the training for that intensive intervention, but it gives you, they do an excellent job of really outlining what literacy looks like and the process of learning to read. And I highly recommend that. Resources for families. One of the things to think about is how you can support families who are going through this. And depending on your school district, kids may be identified as dyslexic, they may not be identified as dyslexic, but if you in your school district know that a student is struggling with the characteristics of dyslexia, then thinking about what are some supports that you can put in place for parents, because like we said earlier, parents really want their kids to know how to read. Parents want their kids to be successful. So on our webpage, we have some resources for families. The child becomes a reader, navigating the school system when your kid is struggling with reading, some questions they could ask, things that every family should know. And then there's also some links to the Children's Dyslexia Centers. There is a Children's Dyslexia Center in Portland, and there's also one in Bangor. And if you have students that you know are struggling and they're looking for someone that they could do some tutoring, or if they just need to get some additional information, those are great resources. And both of the coordinators there do an excellent job supporting the learners in their system. And then 10 things to help your struggling reader. So again, this is just another link that can provide support. The Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity, they do quite a bit of work, and it's that kind of what people go to in terms of the work. So if you have a chance, directing them there. There's also the there's two doctors there that are married, the Shawitzes, that have just done decades and decades of work on dyslexia and have developed a screener themselves. So if there's something that you're looking for, the International Dyslexia Association, the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity are a couple of my personally go-to places that I go to get information. So I am going to go ahead and take a peek in the chat box. I spoke probably, I apologize, a little bit faster than I had intended. So I'm going to take a look and open up. Oh, great, we have some in here. So I'm just going to quickly go through them. I'm going to yeah, so someone asked if the links were on the department page. So if you go to the Maine Department of Education webpage and then click on Special Education, and you'll be able to find in the Special Initiatives section is where the dyslexia work is. And one of the things too to realize, this dyslexia is housed in the special education department, but just because a student has dyslexia does not mean that they're going to necessarily qualify for special education services. They may qualify for a 504. So that's something to work with teachers and your administrators for identification. So I see that, oh, yep, I will post the PowerPoint with the recording so that you can have that. So I'm going to try and skim through these. So people talking about reading was a great escape for them. I'm sure people are still using reading as an escape. I know I personally am, and I know my children are. And it's always a good thing when I can get them away from TV and video games and do reading instead. I'm sure you might all be going through that too. Oh, thank you to whoever put the link in. I appreciate that very much. Somebody asked about the specific learning disability versus dyslexia. It's not, dyslexia may be considered more specific, but it's just not on the IEP. And it depends on your district, it depends on your state if you're going to get that dyslexia diagnosis. To me, it's about, do I know that this student is a struggling reader? Do I know that they have characteristics of dyslexia? Do I know that the instruction that's going on in the classroom may not be providing enough support? To be honest, as a literacy, someone who taught literacy at the college level and was a classroom teacher, for me, it's about taking a step back and looking at, okay, in the classroom, what are we doing? If I have a kid in my class who's struggling with reading, what am I doing as a teacher that may or may not be meeting their needs? So thinking about if they're really struggling and I'm doing these small groups, what about the small group that I'm doing is working and what isn't working? And then adapting the instruction to meet the student's needs. Amanda asked if there was a recommended training that you can take. One of the things I'm working with the department right now is trying to figure out some pilot projects of intensive training for ed techs and for teachers in dyslexia approaches. We don't have, we do have the dyslexia centers in Maine, but it's just 2 of them. So it's trying to figure out what is the best things that we can do, because going through some of these intensive trainings, they take a lot of time to get completely trained in those. But you may have some programming that's done at your school that you might be able to do to support those students if you're not able to get that intensive training yourself. Audiobooks, thank you, Tandy. Audiobooks. We have some links and information on our webpage So thinking about, again, we talked about this as during the presentation, kids who are dyslexic can still comprehend what's being read to them. Audiobooks really help speed up the process for them. So especially if you're like thinking about content areas, if I don't have to spend the time trying to process and break apart and think about every single word, but I can listen to it and use that information, then I'm going to be a much more successful student if I have dyslexia. And someone sharing, you know, that the husband is dyslexic, child, chances are, you know, that increase that you may have a child who has dyslexic. Audiobooks are great. Someone shared Reading Navigator was helpful with their high school students. I'm not familiar with that one. Oh, and the 2 centers in dyslexia are through the Scottish Rite, and it's the Portland, so they're just called the Dyslexia Center of Bangor and of Portland. Leveled literacy instruction, I used Fountas and Pinnell myself. The thing about those small groups, and I've used it in my own classroom and taught it to my undergraduates, is that can be really helpful for a lot of students. Dyslexic students are going to need more. They're going to need more phonics instruction that has that scope and sequence. If you go through intensive training, sometimes they'll have an associated scope and sequence that can be very helpful. Again, it's just that building, that cumulative piece, and that systematic way of doing it. Learning Ally, yes, I think I have a link to Learning Ally on our webpage. If I don't, I'm going to add it after this today. Oh, the smart pen that reads to him, reads to a student, getting them. I think the key word for me in that was independence, right? Is being able to do things on their own so that they get that opportunity to feel that success. All right, any other questions? I really thank you so much for participating. I think we have, so Wilson Foundation, so that's going to have some of that phonics piece. The Lucy Calkins, when we talked about reading wars, Lucy Calkins was how I taught reading early on in my career, was about, again, this whole experience of reading, you know, reading different types of literature to kids and being that kind of emotional piece to it, but realizing that they also need that phonics piece, and that phonics can look different for every kid. I had one of my own children when he was in 1st grade, they were all doing phonics, and his teacher said he was already reading. And she said, well, everyone needs phonics, but what she didn't understand was it doesn't have to be the same for every single kid in the class. So phonics for one kid may be like we're doing beginning sounds, but phonics for another kid in your same class could be that they're looking at prefixes and suffixes and their Latin roots, and they're doing more advanced phonics. So I think we need to think beyond the idea that phonics is just going, you know, it's just cat. It's thinking about the morphology. Where'd the word come from? So we got Wilson for some. Spire, some people use Spire. Bookshare does have, you can get some books there as well. Some libraries, if you go online, you can get that as well. And right now, a lot of different educational forums have opened up for free, at least temporary, during this pandemic. And so you might get some information that way as well for those. Other questions? Countess and Pinnell. Well, great. If you don't have any other questions, I really appreciate you taking the time. If you have other questions, feel free. You have my email. Email me whenever you want. And since I'm working from home, it seems like I'm answering emails all the time. So feel free to shoot me an email if you have a question, or if you're working with a teacher or an administrator who wants some more information on dyslexia and you want to have a conversation, I'd be glad to do that. So thank you so much, and you all get the rest of your 10 minutes before lunch back, and I look forward to hearing from you in the future. Thank you. Oh, and for your book, just send me an email to get your credit, your certificate. If you just email me, since you have my email, just email me your favorite children's book and I will send you the certificate. It may not be until later in the week because there's a lot of you. So be patient. But if you don't have it by the end of next week, just email me and say, hey, you forgot me, and I'll make sure I do. Yeah, put the name in the subject line. That's fine. You don't have to write me an annotated bibliography or anything like that. Thank you. Bye.